Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome back to my ongoing review series of Halo the Master Chief Collection. Previously we talked about the gameplay of Combat Evolved, which also served as an opportunity to introduce the weapons, vehicles, and enemies we'll be seeing throughout the rest of this series. So with that established, next on the chopping block is Halo 2, a game that lives up to its title in more ways than one. It's the first time that you play from a second perspective, allows you to dual wield some weapons, and introduces a second Halo for you to stomp around in. Before we get into that, let's wind back to the first thing I noticed when I booted the game up, the lack of a health bar. Whereas Combat Evolved had a health bar that you had to be mindful of, with health packs scattered throughout the map, this game abandoned that in favor of only having the shield and a small window where you can be killed when the shield is brought down. When it comes to this change, I'm of two minds about it. On one hand, it means that if we don't do well in a given section and the next one proves to be difficult, there's less of a disadvantage going into it, meaning my main criticism with the campaign could end up being less common. On the other hand, you can't take too many hits between when your shields drop and when you die, which means hearing your shields drop is no longer a warning to be cautious if your health is full, but now a definite get to cover or you're dead. There's no variability, which means while there's theoretically fewer moments where you can get checkpoint screwed, there's also fewer moments where you can tough it out if there's only one or two enemies left. In practice, this meant I was having to take cover more often, which dragged the pacing down a little bit. With that addressed, let's move on to the weapon variety, as a lot has been changed and added. The assault rifle only appears in the Anniversary Edition's multiplayer mode, in favor of an SMG that can be dual wielded, and the Magnum is relegated to a weapon that fires as quickly as you can hit the button at the expense of losing its scope. As a result of this, you won't be seeing much of either weapon regardless of the game mode. Instead, since they decided you were going to use a precision weapon anyway, they gave you the Battle Rifle, which is a burst fire weapon that can scope. It chews through ammo faster than you might like, but it'll be your primary weapon when you start out. Outside of that, pretty much all of the other weapons and vehicles from the first game return, though there are a few changes. First off, you can now use the Energy Sword and Covenant Wraith, and to make it worth using the former, once you've gotten close enough, you'll automatically dash into enemies. This means despite your movement speed always being the same, you can still make solid use of the Energy Sword if you prefer it over the shotgun. Just bear in mind that whenever the target dies before you reach it, you might be sent flying.
Oh crap! I fell off the edge of the universe. Wait, what the hell? Where the hell did I land? Hang on, I might actually be fine. Look at where I am. Oh my gosh, this is so weird. I've never seen this before. What's gonna happen? Am I about to die? I'm below you. Somehow. I have no idea how much I can do for you right now, unfortunately. Unless I killed myself, but it looks like I wouldn't be able to help much anyway. Uh-oh. I don't see your... Oh, hi! Did you just spawn on top of me? Look down.
Yeah, I did.
Next up, switching weapons is a hell of a lot faster than before. This might seem like a minor change, but it means that instead of waiting for a second or two to properly prepare the Magnum, now you can fire a charged shot from the plasma pistol, and then rapidly switch to the battle rifle while the shot is still flying to nail whoever just lost their shields. This alone meant that my biggest complaint about the single-player campaign showed up less frequently, as now a strategy that was otherwise risky if there was more than one enemy is now a lot more viable. To highlight more specific changes, the Ghost now has a function bound to the right mouse button that will allow it to boost, which makes it a lot easier to run over people even if you can't shoot while doing it. To add some parity between single-player and multiplayer, every vehicle can now be destroyed, with your main way to drop Warthog still being to knock out the driver. As for the Scorpion tank, they've made it much harder to knock out the driver, which means your primary way of dealing with it will be to throw heavy explosives at it, unless you're lucky enough to be able to sneak up on it, at which point you can now steal vehicles by kicking out an enemy driver. It's a feature that I really like, as it allows you a risky means to shift the tide of a battle, and offers significant danger to someone using vehicles if they get careless about their position. Finally, the majority of weapons can now be dual wielded, with the only exceptions being the Energy Sword, shotgun, precision weapons, and heavy explosives. For my time in multiplayer and the higher difficulty levels though, I didn't find it to be all that useful, as the dominant strategy remains to use the plasma pistol to knock over shields, and then to pick them off with a precision weapon. If you're playing in normal mode or in a new variant of the multiplayer we'll be discussing later, it can work out just fine, and in that environment it can be a lot of fun to do things like dual wielding Needlers, as it means a weapon that's already a lot of fun to use is even more satisfying than before. In practice though, it's not something you'll be doing regularly, especially since you automatically drop the offhand when you swap weapons, throw a grenade, or melee someone. The only exception to this appears to be dual needlers, as the needle's homing seems to be more reliable than before, and when you're literally doubling the number of them thrown at an enemy, they fall really quickly. It chews through ammo really quickly as well, but for the first 2 missions when you're playing as an elite, and therefore have needle ammo lying all over the place, it was surprisingly effective. Which was a good thing for me, because dual needlers ended up being my brother's favorite loadout, so even if he had trouble at range, at least I didn't have to worry about anyone flanking us in co-op. Beyond the ability to dual wield, the Covenant got a boatload of new toys to play with, most of which seem focused on bringing some level of parity between the two factions. To give the Covenant a precision weapon and sniper, they introduced the carbine and the beam rifle, the former which fires almost as quickly as you can pull the trigger, while the latter has to be carefully managed so as to not overheat, as it only takes 2 or 3 shots to do so if fired in rapid succession. They also introduced a weapon called the Brute Shot, which is basically a grenade launcher that may not do a whole lot of damage with an individual shot, but which can fire out multiple rounds quickly before needing to reload. The reason for this parity is as previously stated, as you regularly shift focus in the campaign from Master Chief to a Covenant soldier, which means the level variety is greatly improved purely on that basis. There may be similar looking textures within a given area, but the areas themselves are much different, and even within a level, there are substantial differences in the design and appearance. For instance, part of the campaign has you fight in a city where there's been plenty of combat already, and while you might expect it to be the same rubble and buildings throughout, they managed to vary things up considerably. First, they have you clear out and then defend an area, with a mounted gun just in case you want to risk standing in the same place for too long, at which point you find out that Jackals are now sometimes armed with precision weapons instead of circular shields and plasma pistols. In fact, that's not the only change to the Jackals, as it's now a lot easier to hit their hand with a precision weapon, and they now recoil in a way that it's easier to line up the headshot afterward, meaning there's less frustration in taking them out, or at least less reliance on grabbing a nearby plasma pistol. To keep you on your toes, they also throw in an enemy type called the drones, which are flying brats who die pretty quickly, but are obnoxious to hit unless they can be convinced to sit on a wall, and always come in large swarms. That then means even if they're only armed with plasma pistols, the wall of bullets are usually enough to force you into cover, creating a very different environment than you would normally have to deal with. After dealing with every enemy type imaginable at that position, you have a street fight with elites, grunts, and drones facing you directly, while Jackals take up sniping positions on roofs and elevated walkways, which leads to a lot of close quarters encounters as you inch your way through the city. Then you're jumping into a ghost or warthog and contending with a ton of enemy ghosts, a fight that eventually takes you from a coastal setting to a traffic tunnel. Then you have 66 tons of straight up HE spewing divine intervention to drive around in, eventually leading you to a chase through another traffic tunnel as the Covenant try to invoke death by 1,000 cuts, all for the sake of reaching this really scary walker and giving it a piece of your mind. All of that within the span of an hour. I'll grant you that the section I just outlined is by far the most varied of the campaign, and there are parts where the game can be tedious, especially when the Covenant soldier has to deal with the swarming enemy. But even in that section, they still manage to keep things relatively varied by alternating between areas where you have to proceed on foot versus in a Banshee, varying the levels between narrow corridors, slow-moving elevators, and more open areas, all while leaving different weapons lying around to encourage you to approach each challenge slightly differently. That being said, there are still a few moments where my main criticism of the campaign crops up again, with most of them revolving around one of two things. First off, there are sections where you're on your own against a large room of enemies and have to thread the needle with whatever you got checkpoints screwed with, which thankfully don't appear all that often. Second, if you're dealing with a significant number of vehicles, which also doesn't happen very often, but given that you can end up being one ghost against many, there are times when your best answer is to find cover and either sticky grenade them into oblivion, snipe out the drivers, or barrel right through them without even attempting to fight. One scene in particular embodies the first point, despite the fact that the setup to it and the comment from Master Chief are really amusing. In that situation, they're introducing a new enemy type called the Brutes, who rely on a larger health pool instead of shields, and to emphasize this, they give you a Needler as your starting weapon. They also have a tendency to charge straight for you if you hurt them enough, which leads to scenarios that ratchet up the pressure as this hulking, well, brute comes barreling toward you faster than you can run away from it. However, because of the number of grunts and brutes that are thrown at you, your lack of a precision weapon starts to become more noticeable. And while they do eventually give you carbines to account for this, by giving the brutes the weapon and making you fight them for it, the fact that you're in an open area creates the most blatant example of needing to repeat a section as you figure out how best to use your limited weapon selection. In fact, to really demonstrate this, here's the moment that caused me to remember this scene, as literally the first time I played it.
Oh, you've gotta be...
The faster you can kill those brutes, the...
Really amused by the introductory scene when it occurred, but didn't even last 2 seconds after that solid impression. To be fair, it did give me a golden chance to dual-wield Needlers, but since it's a lot easier to take brutes and grunts out by going for the head, I'll let you guess what I typically went with. To round out our discussion on the campaign, let's talk about the insanity that was the game's legendary mode. In many ways, it reminds me of the first game, as it was really difficult at first and then became seemingly insurmountable by the second mission when it shouldn't have. However, instead of just throwing too many enemies at you, which they sorta do anyway, you would think Halo 2 would have learned its lesson, realized what it could and couldn't get away with, and found a way to give you opportunities to actually fight back. And at first, that's what it seemed like. It took me 2 to 3 times as long to get through the first mission, but it didn't matter all that much because I had started to figure out what I could and couldn't get away with. So once I'm in the city level, surely I'll be better prepared. So, here comes the first attempt to clear the place out. Nothing too bad so far, made it through the standoff, so let's see how we do against the... Did I just get one shot? Did that jackal just one-shot me? Okay, I know I was at full health for that one. I don't think that stupid jackal even hit the head. Are you done yet? Son of a bitch. So yeah, I can live with things like a sticky grenade or an energy sword being a one-shot, because both of those are a matter of paying attention and not allowing enemies to get too close. I didn't even mind the fact that beam rifles could two-shot me in heroic mode, because you had one warning shot that would instantly take out your shields, letting you know to hit the deck and to keep your eyes open. But giving multiple enemies in a single wave the ability to one-shot you from literally any distance when our only countermeasure is either trial and error or clairvoyance is when it goes from skillful to bullshit. And I have no qualms condemning this game's legendary mode purely on that basis. Though it was technically manageable in the initial defense points, that was only because you also had a named character who was, due to his name's status, given the plot armor of God. Once you move on to the street fight though, the mixture of them plus all the other enemies you have to contend with on top of usually not having anyone to back you up made it an absolute pain. To say nothing as to how unreliable the checkpoints were in the following vehicle section. With that said, that covers everything I have to say about the campaign, but before we move on, there is a major technical issue that's worth mentioning. Whereas before there were subtitles during gameplay sections, at least for important dialogue, Combat Evolved and Halo 4 seem to be the only games in the Master Chief Collection where that happens. In some of the games we'll end up discussing, it doesn't necessarily matter, as when you get far enough away from someone, they'll switch to a radio so you can still hear them. In this game, however, that isn't the case, with the biggest problem occurring in the final battle. In it, you have two characters arguing about something as you're trying to finish the game, but the two of them are far enough away from you to where it's very hard to hear them over the din of battle, which is further amplified by the fact that because of said battle, you're having to split focus between listening to what they have to say and not dying. The subtitles show up for cutscenes, even though the timing on them is all kinds of messed up in the Anniversary Edition, but at least they're there. For the game itself though, if I were deaf, I would end up missing a lot of key details. Why is this guy going onto a Pelican dropship? Why did that explosion just happen? What is this thing? And why do I care that the AI lady wants me to get close to it? And yes, I know I'm being really vague about the story, we will get there. All that matters for now is that if I were deaf or if I had screwed up the audio balance in the settings, I would have no idea about half of what was going on in the story, which is a major oversight for the most basic accessibility option known to man. I don't know if this was the case for the game's original release, but how do you screw up something as basic as subtitles? Especially when you released an Anniversary Edition for this game alongside the original release of the Master Chief Collection, which should have allowed you the opportunity to realize this oversight back in 2014. Speaking of which, before we delve into multiplayer, let's talk about that Anniversary Edition. As while there is that major oversight, the improved graphics are excellent. Some of the texture work is a bit hit or miss, especially where Rubble is concerned, but the lighting, cutscenes, and sound design are all greatly improved. What's even better is that it's a lot more flexible this time around, as now you can swap out the graphics in the middle of cutscenes, though this is likely the reason why the timing on the subtitles is so messed up, and the change will also swap between classic and anniversary sound effects and music. That being said, however, while it may have escaped the uncanny valley that Combat Evolved fell into, it wasn't able to escape the issues with screen clutter. With how radically different the lighting and sound design are, it's like you're playing an entirely different game. And with the lighting especially, the greater contrast means there's even more of an issue of enemies being hidden where you can't reasonably see them. The best example of this happens when you start out with just a Needler. In classic graphics, everything is clear-cut, with brutes being introduced as a new unit type, grunts to run interference as you're scrambling for cover or a secondary weapon, and it's very easy to know where enemies are and what they're outfitted with. Switch to the anniversary graphics though, and there are times when you go outside of the central walkway that a charging brute rolls a nat 20 on his stealth check. This despite the fact that you really don't want to stay in that central walkway in order to ensure that you only have to deal with enemies coming from one direction, meaning you have even less options if you want to make it out in one piece. When I played the co-op mode with my brother, it ended up being a running gag that if you wanted to see what the hell was going on, you would hit tab for the classic graphics. And if you wanted to be impressed by how pretty everything is, you would stay in anniversary mode. This is especially annoying because the elite soldier doesn't have a flashlight, but instead a temporary cloaking device, which is certainly useful when you're playing as him, but means you can't even use the excuse of just turning on the flashlight to get around the issue when it appears on his missions. It's also an issue that presents itself in multiplayer. For instance, here's a map called Zanzibar that was introduced with this game. It's a really solid map for both Team Slayer and Capture the Flag, as there's a lot of verticality, plenty of ways to approach the building, and the rotating fan blades offer a neat gimmick that can affect how you get to the high ground, assuming no one is in a position to punish you for it. What I've shown you up to now is what it looks like in Halo 2, and while the texture work is basic, opting to make the place look like a concrete jungle, it's simple enough for the red and blue armor of both teams to pop out, so it does the job well enough. And here's what it looks like in the Anniversary Edition, with a ton of extra detail along the walls and grounds, and with the interior of the building seeming completely different, with a lot more places for a stray player to hide if they want to camp out by the flag. This creates a much different scenario whenever a fight breaks out in that building, as just finding your opponent in the shadows and extra particle effects from all the grenades thrown in becomes half the battle. And to show why this is such a big deal, here's what the map looks like in Halo 3. It keeps the same layout, changing up where weapons are placed given the changes that game made to them, but the lighting remains the same. That then means you have a nice middle ground between Halo 2's Classic and Anniversary editions, where one is a simpler first attempt, the other is a victim of overdesign, with Halo 3's iteration being a perfect blend of both. Speaking of multiplayer, I led with the Anniversary edition because, unlike in Combat Evolved, there's two separate multiplayer modes for Halo 2, one for the classic graphics and one for the Anniversary edition. The reason for this is because even beyond the changes to lighting and sound design, they also add some gameplay changes between the different modes. For instance, there are two vehicles that were added with Halo 3 that occasionally replace a Ghost or Banshee, both of which play fairly differently to their respective replacements. Regardless of those changes, both the classic and anniversary modes are substantial legs up on Combat Evolved, purely on the back of better spawns. Even for Team Slayer on Blood Gulch, there's no more spawning into the middle of an entire enemy team, which means a lot of the initial frustration is already taken away. More to the point, pretty much every little change that we've discussed earlier helps make the multiplayer a lot more fun. With the battle rifle taking over as the precision weapon of choice, and with it being your primary weapon instead of your secondary, there's no 2 seconds where you're hoping not to get shot right as you spawn before you can fight back, which means even if you're on the edge of the action, you can jump in relatively quickly. Also, they greatly reduce the spawn rate on sniper rifles and other specialized weapons, meaning while you can still get sniped from halfway across the map, it doesn't happen as often unless the person who gets it is a really good shot. Not that it isn't still annoying when it does happen though. Even in the Anniversary Edition, where the camera follows where the shot came from, the sound effect when you get hit is so visceral that you're instantly angry the moment you're hit by it. Such a good sound effect, torpedoed by being associated by the most frustrating thing that can happen in this game. Outside of that, there's a few new spins on the game modes which are worth mentioning. First up is a variant of Slayer where, instead of starting with a precision weapon, you start out with either the SMG or assault rifle. In theory, this creates a much different environment for you to play in, as now it's not just a matter of taking cover and being very precise with your shots, but is instead a matter of getting the jump on your opponent and, in an emergency, being good with your sidearm. However, I don't have a lot of footage of it because, in practice, it normally means the mad dash for the good weapons ends up being even more rewarded than before, especially since precision weapons still show up in parts of the map. There's already a degree to which knowing where the sniper rifle and explosives are can help you, but in this case, it's a little too reliant on that for my liking. And given that we don't have a choice on where we spawn from, it can feel like matches in that mode boil down to luck instead of skill. The second one is a game variant that I really like, One Flag Capture the Flag. I am a sucker for asymmetrical game modes, even when it's something as basic as two identical teams who have slightly different goals. That's not to say that normal capture the flag can't be interesting, but it has a greater chance to snowball because, with this being the internet, you're more likely to run into disputes on how many people should be defending versus attacking, and the action can be very spread out and sporadic because of that. When there's only one flag to either capture or defend, with the teams periodically switching roles, the action remains much more focused and is a lot more hectic, which has made for some of the most fun I've had with Halo multiplayer. So on the whole, Halo 2 is definitely a game that's worth checking out on its own, as it takes a lot of what worked in Combat Evolved and adds to it with greater weapon and enemy variety, more varied level design, and by fixing a lot of the issues the original game's multiplayer mode has. And when it comes to the Anniversary Edition, it's a really good demonstration of what a graphical overhaul should look like, as while there are still issues with the lighting covering up enemies, it's a lot more flexible than the Anniversary Edition for Combat Evolved. There are still issues, as I'm annoyed that there's no subtitles for important in-game dialogue, but it is a solid first-person shooter that stands on its own far better than I expected it to, and for that I am quite grateful. And with that said, that is where I shall be ending it for now. As with Combat Evolved, there was plenty to discuss with respect to the gameplay, and since I'll be bundling the discussion of Halo 3 and ODST into the same video, it made sense to give this one its own section as well. It won't be the end of the discussion surrounding this game, as I have a lot to say about Halo 2's story, but as with Combat Evolved, we'll be saving that for after we finish discussing gameplay. For now though, thank you all for watching, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you for the next one.